There's a question that still haunts me, one I've never been able to answer. How did he always know? How did he know the exact moment I stepped away from the window? How did he know the second I was coming downstairs, and the night he finally got inside? Was he waiting for me to come down, or was he waiting for me to stay asleep? I'll never know. And honestly, that's the part that terrifies me the most. Let me start from the beginning. About a year ago, I relocated to a new town for work. I'd landed a decent position at a company about 40 minutes from where I'd been living, and rather than deal with the commute, I decided to just move closer. I found a house in a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It was affordable, well-maintained, and sat on a quiet street lined with nearly identical homes. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seems to happen. I had visited the area a handful of times before committing. Drove through the streets, walked around the block, checked out what was nearby. It seemed peaceful, almost unnervingly so. I never saw anyone outside. No kids playing in yards, no neighbors chatting over fences, no one walking dogs. Every house looked occupied, cars in driveways, lights on behind curtains, but the people themselves were invisible. Even on the day I moved in, with a full-sized moving truck parked in front of the house and me hauling boxes back and forth for hours, not a single person came outside. No one waved. No one introduced themselves. No one even peeked through their blinds, as far as I could tell. It was like living on a movie set where all the extras had gone home. I didn't mind at first. I've always been the kind of person who keeps to himself. I wasn't looking for block parties or neighborhood barbecues. I just wanted a quiet place to live, and this certainly qualified. But there's a difference between quiet and hollow, and this place leaned heavily toward the latter. The first 2 days after the move were consumed by unpacking. I barely left the house. It had snowed the night I arrived. A thick, heavy snowfall that blanketed everything in white and muffled the world outside into near total silence. The weather gave me another excuse to stay indoors, tearing open boxes and trying to make the house feel like home. By the end of that second day, I was exhausted. Every muscle ached, and my brain was foggy from the stress of organizing an entire household. I went to bed early, probably around 8 o'clock, and fell asleep almost instantly. I don't know what woke me. My eyes opened, and I was immediately fully alert, the way you wake up when something pulls you out of sleep rather than letting you surface naturally. I rolled over and looked at my phone on the nightstand. It was 2007 a.m. The house was silent, but not entirely. There was a sound coming from outside, a rhythmic scraping, followed by a soft, airy thump. Then a pause. Then the scraping again, and another thump. Over and over, steady as a metronome. I lay there for a minute trying to place it. It sounded mechanical almost, but there was something organic about the rhythm, something inconsistent enough to suggest a human hand behind it. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed back the covers and crossed the room to the window that overlooked the front of the house. There was a man in my driveway. He was shoveling snow. He moved slowly, deliberately, dragging the blade of the shovel across the concrete and then heaving the snow off to the side in a practiced motion. He was dressed head to toe in dark winter clothing, a heavy coat, gloves, boots, and a hat pulled low over his face. In the dim glow of the streetlight, I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape moving methodically back and forth across my driveway. I watched him for 2, maybe 3 minutes. My first thought was that this was some kind of neighborly gesture. Maybe someone on the street had a tradition of helping out new residents. But at 2 in the morning, without ever introducing himself, without so much as a wave or a knock on my door, something about it felt deeply wrong. I decided to go outside and talk to him, figure out who he was, thank him if it was genuinely well-intentioned, and at least put a face to the figure. I pulled on my boots and a jacket, went downstairs, and opened the front door. He was gone, not walking away, not retreating down the street, just gone. The driveway was half shoveled, a clean line cutting through the snow before stopping abruptly midsection, as if the man had simply evaporated in the middle of a stroke. The shovel was gone too. I stood on the porch, scanning the street in both directions. Every house was dark, every driveway was buried in untouched snow. The neighborhood was utterly still, the kind of stillness that feels intentional, like the world is holding its breath. I went back inside, locked the door, and eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I kept expecting a knock on the door. Surely the man would come by during normal hours, introduce himself, maybe explain his strange midnight landscaping habit, but no one came. The hours crawled by in silence. It snowed again that afternoon, erasing the evidence of last night's shoveling as if it had never happened. I went to bed around 11 that night, and just like before, I woke up at almost exactly 2 a.m. The scraping sound was back. This time, I didn't waste time watching from the window. I threw on my coat, shoved my feet into my boots, and went straight for the front door. I yanked it open and stepped onto the porch. Empty, again. The driveway was partially cleared, the same interrupted pattern as before. A fresh line of shoveled concrete that simply stopped, as though the man had vanished mid-motion the instant I opened the door. I walked down to the end of the driveway and looked up and down the street. Nothing. No footprints leading away from the house, no figure disappearing around a corner, just snow and silence and the orange glow of streetlights reflecting off the white ground. I stood out there for 15 minutes, the cold seeping through my jacket, waiting for him to reappear. He didn't. This pattern repeated for several nights. Every night around 2, I'd wake to the sound of shoveling. Every time I went outside, the man was already gone. It was like he had some sixth sense, some impossible awareness of my movements. As long as I stayed at the window, he was there, a dark shape scraping snow off my driveway with mechanical patience. But the moment I moved toward the stairs, toward the door, he disappeared. I stopped going outside after the 3rd or 4th night. There was no point. Instead, I'd lie in bed and listen, the rhythmic scrape and thump becoming a grotesque lullaby that I couldn't escape. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the man had some connection to the previous owners. Maybe he was mentally ill and had fixated on this house for reasons that only made sense to him. Maybe it was genuinely harmless, just unsettling, but I couldn't convince myself. Something about the way he moved was wrong, too slow, too deliberate, like a person going through motions that their body remembered but their mind had left behind. And the disappearing, the way he seemed to know the exact second I was coming, that wasn't normal. That wasn't something you could explain away with good hearing or peripheral vision. He vanished from inside my driveway soundlessly, without leaving tracks. I thought about calling the police, but what would I report? A man shoveling my driveway? They'd laugh. They'd file it under neighbor dispute or noise complaint and forget about it. And technically, he hadn't done anything threatening. He hadn't approached the house, hadn't tried the doors, hadn't spoken to me. He just shoveled, silently, every night, at 2 in the morning. On the 6th night, everything changed. I woke at 2 a.m., right on schedule. My body had adapted to the pattern, my internal clock synced to this nightmare routine. But this time, the shoveling sound was already fading as I opened my eyes. By the time I reached the window, it had stopped completely. The driveway was fully cleared, every inch of it scraped clean, and the man was nowhere in sight. But I knew he was still out there. I could feel it the way you feel someone watching you in a dark room. That prickling awareness along the back of your neck that defies logic but never lies. I stood at the window for 2 full minutes, scanning the yard, the street, the shadows between the houses. Nothing moved. The silence was absolute. Frustrated and running on adrenaline, I decided to go outside one more time. I rushed downstairs, threw on my boots, grabbed my coat, and pulled open the front door. I nearly collapsed backward. He was standing on the porch, right there. Less than a foot from the door, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him. He must have walked up while I was getting dressed, timed it perfectly, positioned himself so that the door would open directly into his presence. He was taller than I expected, well over 6 feet, with a frame that seemed too thin for his height, like his body had been stretched. His coat was dark, stained, and hanging loose on his shoulders. In one hand, he held the shovel at his side, the blade resting against the porch boards. His other hand hung limp, but it was his face that destroyed me. He had a thick, tangled beard that looked like it hadn't been groomed in months, maybe years. His hair was long and black, hanging past his shoulders in wet, matted clumps. His skin had a grayish pallor, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in a very long time. And his eyes, God, his eyes, they were wide open, unblinking, ringed with dark circles, so deep they looked like bruises. He stared at me with an intensity that I can only describe as hollow. There was focus there, but no thought behind it, like looking into the eyes of something that was operating on instinct alone. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The moment stretched out, unbearable in its stillness. The cold air burned my lungs, but I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't fill my chest. Fear had compressed everything inside me into a tight, frozen knot. Finally, I forced words out. My voice came out cracked and thin. "What are you doing? What do you want?" His eyes narrowed, not in anger, not in recognition. More like the question had reached him through water, distorted and delayed. His jaw tightened beneath the beard, muscles working as though he was trying to speak but had forgotten how. Then, without a word, he turned. Slowly, mechanically. He stepped off the porch, walked down the driveway, and continued onto the road. I watched him move down the center of the street, his dark figure growing smaller against the snow, until the darkness swallowed him entirely. I locked every door that night, checked every window twice. I seriously considered calling the police, but stopped myself for the same reasons as before. He was gone. I had no name, no address, nothing concrete to report beyond a feeling. And feelings don't file police reports. The next day, it didn't snow. The sun actually came out for the first time since I'd moved in, and the neighborhood looked almost normal in the daylight. I spent the day trying to distract myself, watching TV, organizing the last few boxes, anything to keep my mind from circling back to that face on the porch. That night, I went to bed tense and alert. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, my body resisting unconsciousness as if it knew better. At 2 a.m., my eyes opened. There was no shoveling sound. There was no shoveling sound. There was no sound at all, just thick, pressing silence. But I was awake, pulled from sleep by that same invisible hand, and I lay there in the dark, listening. Then I heard it. Below me, a quiet thump, barely audible, the kind of sound a house makes when it settles in the cold. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored it completely, but these weren't normal circumstances. I lay still for another full minute, straining my ears. Nothing followed. No second sound, no footsteps, no scraping, just silence. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't lie there and wonder. Not after everything. I got out of bed and walked to the top of the stairs. The house below was dark. I descended slowly, one step at a time, my hand trailing along the wall for balance. My eyes were locked on the front door at the end of the hallway. It was closed. The deadbolt was turned. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. I reached the bottom of the stairs and took a step toward the door. And that's when I caught it. Something in my peripheral vision, off to the left, in the living room. I turned my head slowly. He was standing in the middle of the room. His back was to me. The shovel hung at his side. He was completely motionless, standing in the pitch dark like a piece of furniture that had always been there. He wasn't doing anything, wasn't moving, wasn't breathing as far as I could tell. Just standing in my living room in absolute darkness at 2 a.m. I don't know how long I stood there staring at him. It could have been 5 seconds or 30. Time had stopped making sense. My body was locked between the urge to run and the paralysis of pure animal terror. I chose to run. I turned, took the stairs 3 at a time, locked myself in the bedroom, and called 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I whispered the address, told them someone had broken into my house, and pressed myself against the far wall, staring at the bedroom door, waiting for the handle to turn. It never did. The house remained completely silent until the officer arrived 6 minutes later. He found the back door wide open, the lock intact but the latch undone from the inside. No one else was in the house. No footprints in the snow leading to or from the back door, which made no sense and which the officer didn't seem interested in explaining. I gave him the best description I could. Tall, thin, long black hair, heavy beard, dark clothing, carried a shovel. The officer wrote it all down, nodded and told me they'd file a report. There was no follow-up, no investigation, no patrol car stationed outside for the night. I was alone again. I moved out 2 months later. I never saw the man again after that night, but I never stopped checking. Every night at 2 a.m., my eyes would snap open, and I'd lie there in the dark, listening. Sometimes I'd hear a sound, a creak, a thump, the wind against the windows, and my heart would seize. But he didn't come back, at least not while I was still there. A friend of mine suggested the man might have been sleepwalking. Something about the way I described his movements, that slow mechanical quality, the blank stare, the repetitive behavior at the same time every night. Sleepwalkers can appear functional, can perform complex tasks, can even interact with their environment in limited ways while being completely unconscious. Maybe, but sleepwalking doesn't explain how he knew every single time I left the window. It doesn't explain how he vanished from an open driveway without leaving footprints. And it doesn't explain how he got inside my house through a door that was locked from the inside. I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times, examined every theory, every rational explanation. None of them hold up completely. There's always a gap, always a detail that doesn't fit, always a question that leads nowhere. But one question keeps me up more than any other, and it's the one I started with. That last night when I came downstairs and found him standing in my living room with his back to me, he wasn't facing the front door. He wasn't facing the back door either. He was facing the stairs. He was facing the direction I would come from, and he was waiting. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gone back upstairs, if I had walked closer, if I had spoken, if I had touched him. And some nights, lying awake at 2 a.m. in a different house in a different city, I hear something outside, a faint scraping, a soft thump, and I tell myself it's nothing. I tell myself it's the wind, or the neighbors, or my imagination filling the silence with old fears. But I don't go to the window anymore, because I know that if I look outside and see a dark figure standing in my driveway, slowly dragging a shovel across the pavement, I won't be able to stop myself from going downstairs. And this time, he might not have his back turned. He told me he'd been shot. He was hunched over in my hallway, clutching his stomach, gasping for breath. And I almost believed him. I almost rushed to help. But then his shirt shifted, and I saw the silver handle of a gun tucked into his waistband. That's when I understood. The gunshot, the screaming, the desperate sprint to my door, it was all a performance. And I was supposed to be the audience that didn't make it to the final act. But let me go back to the beginning. I'd been dreaming about living in the woods for years. Not in some romantic, Thoreau-inspired way. It was practical. I worked remotely, housing prices in the city had become absurd, and I craved silence, real silence. The kind you can't get when you share walls with strangers and live 3 blocks from a highway. Last October, I found the perfect opportunity. A small cabin about 2 hours from the nearest city, tucked deep into a wooded area off a county road that most GPS systems barely recognized. The seller was a younger guy, mid-20s, offloading his late parents' property. He said they'd kept it in good shape and even modernized a few things. Updated wiring, proper insulation, a functional bathroom. From the outside, it still looked like something out of a frontier novel, but inside it was comfortable enough. Small, but livable. Because the drive out was brutal and the cabin was compact, I got rid of most of what I owned before moving. Sold furniture, donated clothes, tossed years' worth of accumulated junk. By the time moving day came, everything I had fit into my car. No truck needed, no help required. I loaded up, drove 2 hours into the wilderness, and arrived at my new home just as the afternoon light was starting to fade. The first hour was spent hauling boxes inside and figuring out the layout. The cabin was essentially 4 rooms, a living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. That was it. No basement, no attic, no garage. Just a wooden box in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees so thick you couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. I was arranging things in the kitchen when I heard boots on the front porch. I opened the door to find a man standing there with his hand raised, about to knock. He smiled immediately, wide and warm, the kind of smile that takes up someone's entire face. "Hey there! Saw some activity over here and figured I'd come say hello." He extended his hand. "I'm Fletcher. I live just down the trail. We're neighbors." He was somewhere around 40, average height, average build, with a friendly, open face and the kind of relaxed energy that suggested he'd lived out here long enough to forget what stress felt like. I shook his hand, introduced myself, and we fell into easy conversation on the porch. He asked about where I was from, what brought me out here, how I liked the cabin so far, standard neighborly stuff. He was talkative, more than I was used to, but genuine, or at least he seemed genuine. After about 15 minutes of chatting, Fletcher leaned to the side and glanced past me through the open door. "Mind if I take a look inside? I've always been curious about this place. Never got to see the interior." I hesitated for a half second, then stepped aside. The cabin was mostly empty anyway, just boxes and bare furniture, and he seemed harmless enough. He walked through the room slowly, commenting on the fireplace, the kitchen layout, the size of the bedroom. It took all of 3 minutes to see everything. By the time we were done with the tour, the sun had dropped below the tree line. The forest outside had turned dark surprisingly fast, the way it does when there's heavy canopy blocking whatever twilight remains. I figured Fletcher would take the hint and head home. He didn't. Instead, he sat down on the couch, leaned back, and kept talking. Casually, comfortably, like we were old friends catching up and the night was still young. I stood near the door, arms crossed, waiting for a natural break in the conversation. When one didn't come, I made one. "Hey, Fletcher, it's getting pretty late. You should probably head back before it gets too dark out there." He blinked, then laughed, standing up quickly. "Oh man, you're right. Sorry about that. Lost track of time." He thanked me for the chat, smiled that same wide smile, and walked out into the dark. I noticed he hadn't driven here. No car, no headlamp, no flashlight. He just stepped off the porch and disappeared into the blackness of the woods on foot. I closed the door and locked it. Something about those last few minutes had left me feeling off balance. Not scared exactly, but alert. The way your instincts quietly shift when something doesn't sit right, even if you can't articulate what it is. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The man was friendly. Overly so, maybe. But that wasn't a crime. Some people just don't read social cues well, especially people who live alone in the forest. I got the fireplace going after a few failed attempts and sank into the couch. The cabin was extraordinary in its silence. No traffic, no neighbors through the walls, no distant sirens or barking dogs, just the soft crackle of burning wood and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I closed my eyes and let the warmth wash over me. I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cabin was dim, the air cooler. I checked my phone. Just under 2 hours had passed. I stood up, stretched, and went to the kitchen to fill a glass of water. I was thinking about a shower and maybe reading for a bit before heading to bed properly, and that's when I heard it. A shuffling sound. Right outside the front door. Close. Not like an animal passing through. More like weight shifting on wooden planks. Like someone standing on the porch, adjusting their footing. I froze, the glass half filled under the tap. Water ran over my fingers as I listened. The sound didn't repeat. A full minute passed in absolute silence. I told myself it was nothing. A raccoon, maybe. A branch falling against the side of the cabin. But I couldn't let it go. I set the glass down and walked to the front door. The cabin didn't have a peephole. Instead, the door had two small rectangular windows set into the upper half, covered by short fabric curtains. I reached up and pushed one of the curtains aside. Fletcher was standing right there. His face was inches from the glass. His eyes were wide, caught in the act of something he hadn't expected to be interrupted. We both flinched. He recovered faster than I did, laughing that same easy laugh and stepping back half a pace. "Hey, sorry. I was just about to knock." My heart was slamming. I kept my hand on the curtain and didn't open the door. "Fletcher, what are you doing here? It's late." I know, he said, still grinning. "I just started up a campfire back at my place and thought maybe you'd want to come hang out. Share a drink or something. Beautiful night for it." It was pitch black and near freezing. There was nothing beautiful about it. "Where exactly is your cabin?" I asked, partly to stall, partly because I wanted information. He turned and pointed down one of the narrow trails that branched away from my property into the forest. "Just about a mile that way. Easy walk." I looked past him. The trail was a strip of absolute darkness. The trees swallowed whatever faint starlight existed above the canopy. You couldn't see 10 feet down that path. "No thanks," I said firmly. "I appreciate it, but I just want to settle in alone for a few days. Get used to the place." His smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes shifted. A flicker, barely perceptible, like a door closing behind a window. Then he looked past me into the cabin, his gaze landing on the fireplace. "Well, why don't I just hang out here then? You've already got a fire going. We could just—" "No." I cut him off. My voice was hard now, stripped of politeness. "I wasn't asking. Not tonight, Fletcher. I need to be alone." I let the curtain fall closed and stepped back from the door. Through the fabric, I could see the dark outline of his body still standing on the porch. He didn't move. 5 seconds, 10, 15. He just stood there, motionless, as if deciding something. Then, finally, the shape shifted. I heard boots on the porch steps, and then the soft crunch of footfall on the forest floor. I moved to the window and watched him walk toward the trail, his figure dissolving into the trees within seconds. My hands were trembling. That wasn't friendliness, that was something else. The insistence, the refusal to leave, the fact that he'd been standing silently on my porch for God knows how long before I caught him. And now he wanted me to follow him down a pitch-black trail into the middle of the forest at night. Every alarm in my body was firing. I went back to the kitchen and picked up my water glass, trying to steady my breathing. I took a long drink and leaned against the counter, replaying everything in my head. The overly familiar introduction, the way he'd invited himself inside, the lingering on the couch, the return visit in the dark, the attempt to lure me into the woods. Each piece on its own was explainable. Together, they formed a pattern that made my skin crawl. I was still standing there, processing, when a sound shattered the silence. A single, sharp crack, unmistakable. A gunshot. It echoed through the forest, bouncing off the trees and fading into the distance. It had come from the direction of the trail, the same trail Fletcher had just walked down. I set the glass down and moved to the front door, pulling it open slowly and stepping onto the porch. The forest was black and impenetrable. The echo had died, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. And then I heard screaming. Fletcher's voice, high and ragged, tearing through the woods. He was screaming my name, screaming for help, and the sound was getting closer. Fast. I couldn't see him yet, just darkness and trees and the narrow mouth of the trail. My body locked up. Every instinct told me to go back inside and lock the door, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Then he burst out of the tree line. He was sprinting, full speed, arms pumping, his face twisted in what looked like pure terror. He hit the clearing in front of my cabin and didn't slow down. By the time I registered what was happening, he was already past me, through the open door and inside. I spun around, expecting to see someone else emerge from the forest behind him. A pursuer, a threat, something that would explain the gunshot and the screaming, but nothing came. The trail was empty. The woods were silent. I stepped back inside and turned to face Fletcher. He was hunched over in the hallway, one hand braced against the wall, the other pressed against his stomach. He looked up at me, eyes wild and desperate. "He shot me," he gasped. "Someone out there! On the trail!" He shot me. He was leaning to one side, his shirt riding up on the opposite hip. And that's when I saw it, the unmistakable silver handle of a revolver tucked into his waistband, partially concealed by his jacket. Everything clicked into place in a single, nauseating instant. There was no one on the trail. There was no attacker. Fletcher had fired that shot himself. He'd created a reason to come back, a reason for me to open the door, a reason to be inside my cabin with that door closed behind us. I didn't think. I grabbed my car keys off the counter near the door, turned and ran. Straight out the front door, off the porch, across the gravel and into my car. Fletcher called after me, shouting my name twice, but he didn't follow. I jammed the key into the ignition, threw the car in reverse, and tore down the dirt road without looking back. I called 911 from the main road, my voice shaking so badly the dispatcher asked me twice to repeat my address. A separate officer was dispatched to the cabin while I drove straight to the station. They found Fletcher still inside. He was sitting on the living room chair, calm and composed, as if he'd been expecting company. The officer said he looked like a man waiting for someone to come home. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't speak during questioning. The investigation revealed that there was no neighboring cabin, no Fletcher registered in any database they could access, no identification on his person, no vehicle, no history. The man had seemingly materialized from the forest with no verifiable past and no explanation for his presence. His revolver was fully loaded except for one chamber. The spent casing was never recovered from the trail. I never went back to that cabin. A friend drove out and collected my things a week later. I sold the property through an intermediary and never spoke to the buyer. I don't know if Fletcher was formally charged or what eventually happened to him. The police stopped returning my calls after the second week, and I decided that not knowing was better than knowing. But here's what keeps me awake at night. When that officer arrived and found Fletcher sitting calmly in my living room, he wasn't sitting on the couch where a guest would sit. He was sitting in the chair that faced the front door. And the back door, the one I hadn't even thought to check, was wide open, which means he wasn't waiting for the police. He was waiting for me to come back, And sometimes, late at night in my new apartment in the city, surrounded by traffic noise and neighbors through the walls, I wonder something that I'll never be able to confirm. If I hadn't seen that gun, if I'd stayed even 30 seconds longer, would I have ever walked out of that cabin at all? I want you to imagine something. You're standing in your own kitchen at 3 in the morning. The house is dark. The only sound is water dripping into the sink. And as your eyes adjust, you realize there's something in that sink. Something torn apart. Something that smells like death. And the back door behind you is unlocked. And you know with absolute certainty that whoever put it there is still inside the house with you. That's not a hypothetical. That happened to me, and what they found afterward was worse than anything I could have imagined. A couple of years ago, I moved to a small town for a new job. It wasn't glamorous. The position paid modestly, and the town reflected that. Working class, quiet, a little rough around the edges. But the housing was affordable, which was really the only requirement I had at the time. I found a small 2-story house on the edge of a residential street. It backed up against a stretch of woods that seemed to go on forever. No neighbors behind me, just trees. The house itself was unremarkable. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a kitchen and living area downstairs, and a sliding glass door in the back that opened onto a narrow, fenced yard. The fence ran along both sides but stopped at the tree line, leaving the back completely open to the forest. During the day, it was actually pleasant. At night, it was a wall of black. I moved in on a weekend and started my new job the following Monday. The first 2 weeks were a blur of early mornings, long shifts, and coming home exhausted. I didn't have time to think about much beyond work, eating, and sleeping. I hadn't met many people yet, but the few neighbors I'd encountered seemed decent enough. Polite, kept to themselves, the kind of people who wave from their driveway but don't linger for conversation. It suited me fine. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. It was a Tuesday evening, maybe 15 days after moving in. I got home from work around 6, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The smell hit me before I'd even closed the door behind me. It was foul, not like garbage or spoiled food. Deeper than that, organic and rotting, like something had died inside the walls. It coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. I set my bag down and walked through every room in the house, checking under furniture, opening closets, looking for anything that could explain it. I found nothing. Every room was exactly as I'd left it that morning. After a couple of hours, the smell faded. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe normally. I convinced myself that maybe something had crawled under the house and died. A raccoon, a possum, something like that. It wouldn't be unusual for an area this close to the woods. I told myself I'd check the crawl space over the weekend and let it go. The next evening, the smell was back. This time, I didn't just walk through the house. I searched it. I opened every cabinet, pulled furniture away from walls, checked the bathroom pipes, even stuck my head into the pantry and sniffed around the water heater closet. Nothing. No source. No dead animal. No rotting food. But I did find something else. The sliding glass door at the back of the house was unlocked. The latch was flipped up, clearly and unmistakably, in the open position. I stood there staring at it, trying to remember the last time I touched that door. I hadn't used it since moving in. Not once. I had no reason to. The backyard was just a patch of grass that dissolved into dark woods. The door had been locked when I moved in, and I had verified it during my first night walkthrough, the way you check every door and window when you're sleeping alone in an unfamiliar house. I opened the door and stepped onto the small concrete slab that served as a patio. The yard was quiet. The fence posts on either side cast long shadows in the dim light leaking from the kitchen. Beyond the yard, the tree line stood like a dark curtain. I couldn't see past the first row of trunks. I didn't know if there were houses back there, trails, or just miles of unbroken forest. Standing there at the edge of that darkness, I felt exposed in a way that made my stomach tighten. I went back inside, shut the door firmly, and locked it. I tested the latch twice, pushing against the frame to make sure it held. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about that door. I sat on the couch with the TV on, but I wasn't watching it. I was running scenarios in my head. Maybe I had opened the door at some point and forgotten. Maybe the latch was faulty and had slipped on its own. Maybe the previous tenant had left it unlocked, and I'd only thought I'd checked it. Each explanation felt reasonable on its own, but paired with the smell, something nagged at me. A quiet alarm in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite silence. I told myself that if anything else happened, anything at all, I would call the police immediately. But right now, all I had was an unlocked door and a bad smell. That wasn't a crime. That was just an old house being an old house. I checked every door and window before bed that night. Twice. I woke up sometime in the dead hours of the morning. Not suddenly, not from a nightmare. It was gradual, like something was slowly pulling me toward consciousness. As I surfaced from sleep, I caught the tail end of a sound, a harsh, grinding noise, mechanical and aggressive, like metal scraping against metal. But by the time my eyes were fully open, it had stopped. I lay there in the dark, disoriented, trying to decide if I'd actually heard something or if it had been part of a dream. The house was silent. Then I heard it, a steady dripping sound, rhythmic and clear, echoing up from downstairs. Water hitting metal. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like the kitchen faucet. I must have left the handle slightly open. A minor annoyance, the kind of thing that doesn't warrant panic, but won't let you fall back asleep either. I swung my legs out of bed and stood up, still half conscious, my mind foggy and dull. I walked down the stairs in the dark, not bothering with lights. The dripping grew louder as I approached the kitchen, and then, about halfway across the living room, the smell returned. Not gradually this time. It slammed into me like a physical force, so thick, so putrid, that it shocked me fully awake. My eyes snapped open wide, and my body went rigid. I stepped into the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tile. The faucet was dripping, just as I'd expected. I reached out and pushed the handle down to stop it, but my hand paused mid-motion. There was something in the sink. In the darkness, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it was large, dark, and wet. It filled the basin, pressed up against the drain, and pieces of it had been shoved partway down into the disposal opening. The smell was coming from it, radiating in waves that made my stomach heave. Whatever this thing was, it had been torn apart, ripped or cut into irregular chunks. Flesh, tissue, something organic and destroyed beyond easy identification. My hand was still hovering over the faucet. My brain was struggling to process what I was seeing when my eyes drifted to the right. The sliding glass door. The latch was up. The door was unlocked. The realization hit me like ice water. Someone had been inside my house. Someone had been standing right where I was standing, doing something unspeakable in my sink. And when they heard me getting out of bed upstairs, they had stopped, which meant they might still be here. Every nerve in my body ignited at once. I pulled my hand back from the sink and turned slowly, scanning the dark rooms around me. The living room to my left was a collection of vague shapes: the couch, the TV stand, the bookshelf. The hallway behind me led to the front door and the staircase. To my right, past the kitchen, was a small storage room that I used for coats and cleaning supplies. Every one of these spaces was a potential hiding place. I wanted to turn the lights on. My hand actually twitched toward the switch on the wall, but something stopped me. If this person was still in the house, flipping on the lights would announce exactly where I was, and that I knew they were here. It could force their hand, corner them into doing something desperate. In the dark, at least, we were equal. Neither of us could see the other. I made a decision. I was going back upstairs, slowly, carefully, without making a sound. I would get to my bedroom, lock the door, and call the police. I turned and moved toward the hallway, placing each foot deliberately, rolling my weight from heel to toe to minimize any sound on the hardwood. The house was deathly silent. Not even the dripping anymore. Just my own pulse thundering in my ears and the faint whistle of my breath through clenched teeth. I reached the base of the stairs and placed my hand on the railing. 1 step, 2 steps. The wood groaned softly under me, and I winced, pausing. Nothing. 3 steps, 4. I was almost to the top. Then the silence shattered. Heavy footsteps exploded from the storage room beside the kitchen. Not sneaking, not careful, full, thundering strides like someone who had stopped caring about being heard. They crossed the kitchen in 2 or 3 steps and stopped, right at the sink. I froze on the stairs, every muscle locked, my hand death-gripping the railing. Below me, I heard the person grunting with effort, the wet, sickening sound of something being forced into a tight space. They were shoving the rest of whatever was in the sink down into the drain. The garbage disposal roared to life, a violent mechanical grinding that filled the entire house and vibrated through the floor beneath my feet. It ran for 5, maybe 10 seconds, then clicked off. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Below me, a man's breathing filled the quiet. Deep, ragged, labored, like someone who had just finished something physically demanding. Each exhale seemed to echo through the empty downstairs. Then footsteps again, slower this time. Moving from the kitchen back toward the storage room, I heard the sound of something being gathered, rustling plastic, like a garbage bag being lifted and adjusted. Then the footsteps returned to the kitchen. The sliding glass door opened. A rush of cold forest air swept through the house, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth beneath the lingering stench of rot. The door slid shut. Silence. I don't know how long I stood on those stairs. It could have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. Eventually, I forced my legs to carry me the rest of the way up. I got to my bedroom, closed the door, pressed the lock, and called 911 with hands shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. The police arrived within 12 minutes. They cleared the house room by room while I sat in the back of a patrol car wrapped in a blanket, trying to stop my teeth from chattering. The intruder was gone, presumably out the back door and into the woods. No tracks were visible in the dry grass and fallen leaves, but what they found inside was deeply disturbing. The sink and the pipes beneath it were clogged with biological material. Chunks of flesh, fragments of bone, matted fur. The forensic team spent hours extracting samples from the disposal unit and the drain pipes. Their initial assessment was that the remains were animal, likely a large deer or similar wildlife, that had been butchered and systematically forced into the plumbing over multiple visits. Multiple visits. The smell I'd been encountering for days wasn't some dead animal under the house. It was evidence of someone repeatedly breaking into my home through the back door and using my kitchen as a disposal site. The unlocked door wasn't a mistake or a faulty latch. It was a point of entry that someone had been using while I was at work, while I was asleep, while I was sitting on the couch 10 feet away. The police couldn't explain why. Their working theory was that the intruder had believed the house was still vacant and was using the isolated property as a convenient place to dispose of animal remains. When he realized someone had moved in, maybe he continued out of habit, or maybe he just didn't care. I don't buy that theory. I'd been living there for over 2 weeks. My car was in the driveway. My lights were on every evening. Furniture was visible through the windows. He knew someone was home. He came anyway. A darker possibility has lived in my mind ever since. What if it wasn't a deer? The forensic team said the remains were consistent with large animal tissue, but consistency isn't certainty. What if the person was disposing of something else entirely and chose my house specifically because no one would look twice at a new tenant in a working-class neighborhood who reported a strange smell? What if he wasn't trying to drive me out? What if he was trying to make me complicit without my knowledge? Burying evidence in my pipes, in my home, where it would be found under my roof if anyone ever came looking. I moved out 3 weeks later, didn't even finish the lease. I packed what mattered and left the rest. I live in a different town now, a second-floor apartment with no back door, no sliding glass, and no tree line outside my window. But some nights I still wake up at 3 in the morning. And for a few terrible seconds, before my brain fully surfaces, I swear I can smell it. That deep, rotten sweetness. And I lie perfectly still, listening for the sound of water dripping into a metal sink. Because here's what the police never figured out, and what I've never been able to stop thinking about. They found remnants in the drain from multiple deposits over several days, but the garbage disposal unit was old and partially broken. The landlord confirmed it hadn't functioned properly in over a year, which means the night I was standing on those stairs, listening to that grinding mechanical roar from the kitchen, whatever turned that disposal on, it wasn't the machine. And whatever I heard being forced down that drain, it didn't go through the blades. It's still in the pipes.